The auctioneer hadn't even finished the sentence before Victor Blackidge leaned over the railing and said, loud enough for the whole pen to hear, "Don't waste the ink writing it up. That animal's already dead." Every head turned. Every man laughed. Every man except the young widow standing at the back of the pen in a coat held shut by a single button, holding $25 she had no business spending. She bought the calf anyway. They called her foolish. They called her desperate. A few of them, the kinder ones, called her tragic. Not one of them called her right. But she was. If this story moves something in you, if you've ever been counted out, laughed at, or told that what you're holding isn't worth a thing, subscribe to this channel right now and follow Mara's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, because some stories deserve to go everywhere. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning they buried Thomas Ellison, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the ground was too dry for November. Mara stood at the edge of the plot with her hands folded in front of her, and her jaw set in a way that people would remember later. Not as grief exactly, but as something harder than grief, something that hadn't found its name yet. She was 23 years old. The preacher spoke. The handful of men who'd known Thomas nodded along. The women from the neighboring homesteads brought pies she wouldn't eat and pressed her hands and said things like, "You'll find your footing," and "He was a good man," and she said yes and thank you, and yes because there was nothing else to say, and because she was already counting in her head. $42.30 in the coffee tin above the stove. 11 months left on the second note against the land. 1 milk cow, 2 chickens, a fence that needed new posts on the east side, and a barn roof that leaked in 3 places. No crops in the ground. No cattle. No help. She had watched Thomas manage all of it with the particular kind of confidence that men of that era wore like a second skin. The confidence that came not from success, necessarily, but from the assumption that things would eventually work themselves out because they always had before. She had watched him shake hands on deals she didn't understand and sign papers she wasn't shown and make plans. He meant to tell her about later. Later never came. After everyone left that evening, Mara sat at the kitchen table with the coffee tin open in front of her and the papers spread out, and she did not cry. She had cried the night before, alone, with her face pressed into the pillow so no one could hear. That was done now. Crying had its place, she believed, but its place was not here, not with this arithmetic staring up at her. She was Thomas's wife. She had been his partner in every way the law and custom allowed, which was to say she had cooked and sewed and kept the house and worked beside him in the field when the field needed working, and had opinions about every decision he made, which she offered and which he sometimes took and sometimes nodded past like he hadn't heard. She was smart. She knew she was smart. She had always known it the way you know something you're not entirely supposed to say out loud. Smart didn't put 11 months of mortgage payments in the coffee tin. She spread the papers out again. The debt to the Kessler Bank was $420, an amount that, sitting at that table on that particular evening, might as well have been the moon. The interest alone was eating $3 a month. She had 42 and change. She could sell the milk cow and the 2 chickens, and maybe the good harness Thomas had bought last spring, and that would get her to somewhere around $70, which bought her maybe 2 more months, and the certain knowledge that without a cow she had no milk, no butter, no small income from selling either. She put the papers away. Then she took them back out. Then she put them away again and went to sleep, because she had learned from her mother that the problems that seem impossible at night sometimes show a crack of possible in the morning, and even if they didn't, you still needed sleep to face them. What? The crack, when it appeared, was smaller than she'd hoped. There was a livestock auction the following Saturday in the flat open ground east of the Callaway feed store, the kind of weekly gathering where the valley's ranchers moved animals between themselves and occasionally picked up something useful. Mara had been to these auctions with Thomas a dozen times. She had never bid. She had stood beside him and watched, and sometimes, when an animal came through the gate that struck her as worth more than the crowd was offering, she had pressed her elbow into his arm, and he had glanced at her and sometimes bid and sometimes not. She went alone. She wore the coat with the single button and the good boots Thomas had given her the Christmas before last, and she stood in the back because she had learned, without anyone teaching her, that a widow at an auction was a different creature than a rancher's wife at an auction, and the back was where you could watch without being watched quite as closely. The morning moved along. Bulls went through, cows, heifers, a few horses. The crowd was the usual crowd. Victor Blackidge holding court near the front with his two ranch hands behind him, like posts in the ground, the Alderman brothers sharing a tobacco pouch, old Hank Lund sitting on the fence with his hat down over his eyes like he was asleep, which he never was. Victor Blackidge was not a villain in the way that stories sometimes make men villains. He did not twirl a mustache or count his gold at midnight. He was simply a man who had been right about enough things for long enough that he had stopped being able to imagine being wrong. He owned the largest spread in the valley. He had bred the last two county champions. He knew cattle the way a man knows anything he has spent 40 years and a great deal of money learning to know, which is to say, deeply, but also with the particular blindness of someone who has only ever seen expensive things and therefore mistakes price for quality. He was also the man who had told Thomas Ellison, 6 weeks before Thomas died, that the Ellison homestead was undersized, over-leveraged, and likely to revert to the bank within 18 months. He had said this at the feed store counter with other men listening, and Thomas had come home that evening quieter than usual, and Mara had not asked, and Thomas had not said, and now Thomas was gone, and the 18 months had been revised to 11, and the man who'd made the prediction was standing 30 feet away looking pleased with himself for no reason in particular. Mara watched him. She was good at watching. The calf came in near the end of the morning, which was where they put the animals nobody wanted to spend good time on. She heard it before she saw it. A sound that was less a moo than a kind of tired complaint. The sound of an animal that had been moved around too much and fed too little, and had mostly given up protesting but hadn't entirely quit. The gate opened and the calf came through, and even from the back of the pen, Mara could see that it was thin in a way that had a story behind it. Hip bones showing, the coat rougher than it should have been, one ear drooping at an angle that suggested either injury or habit. The auctioneer gave it maybe 30 seconds. The crowd gave it less. Blackidge leaned over the railing. His voice carried. He had the kind of voice that was accustomed to carrying, that expected rooms and pens and open air to bend toward it. "Don't waste the ink writing it up," he said. "That animal's already dead." The laughter was immediate and widespread, and Mara felt it the way you feel something that isn't aimed at you, but lands on you anyway, the way a stone thrown at a pond still moves the water all the way to the edge. She looked at the calf. She had grown up on a homestead 2 counties over. Her father had kept cattle, not many, and not grand ones, but enough that she had grown up understanding the difference between sick and weak, between broken and bent, between an animal that had used up its future and one that simply hadn't had a decent chance at it yet. She looked at the calf for a long time. The auctioneer was already moving toward the gate. She raised her hand. The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise exactly, but the silence of a room recalibrating. 20 men turning to look at the woman in the back with the single-buttoned coat who had just bid on the animal that Victor Blackidge had written off as already dead. 25, she said. The auctioneer looked at her. Then he looked at the crowd. Then he looked back at her. "Ma'am, do I have $25 for this?" Nobody else bid. Why would they? The man who knew everything about cattle had already told them what this one was worth. "Sold," the auctioneer said, and his voice had in it a small note of something, bewilderment, maybe, or pity, that Mara chose not to hear. She was writing out the chit when she felt, rather than heard, Blackidge come up behind her. He had that quality, the quality of a man who moves through spaces as though they were built for him. "Mrs. Ellison." She didn't turn around immediately. She finished writing the chit. "Mr. Blackidge." "I'm going to say this kindly," he said, in the tone of a man who says things kindly, the way you put a nice dish on a table before you take it away. "That calf won't make it to spring. You just spent money you don't have on a problem you don't need." She turned around then. She was not a small woman, but Blackidge was big in the way that men who take up space intentionally are big, and she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, which she did without any of the adjustment that he was accustomed to producing in people. "I appreciate the concern," she said. He waited, because men like him are not used to "I appreciate the concern" being the whole answer. It was the whole answer. He studied her for a moment. Something moved in his expression. Not quite contempt, not quite curiosity, but something between them that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. "Your husband was a decent man," he said. "I'd hate to see his land go the way it's going to go." "His land," Mara said, "is my land." She picked up the chit and walked to the gate. The elderly man who helped her load the calf into the borrowed wagon was named Oscar Venn, and he had come to this valley from somewhere in Central Europe 20 years ago, with an accent no one had ever quite learned to place, and a knowledge of land and animals that no one had ever quite learned to argue with, partly because arguing with Oscar Venn required you to follow a line of thinking that moved in three directions simultaneously. He was 71 years old and walked with a cane that he used primarily as a pointer when he was making a point, which was often. He looked at the calf in the wagon. He looked at Mara. He said nothing for a long moment. "You paid 25, he said. "Yes." The others, they thought, I know what they thought. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was not agreeing but was acknowledging that agreement was not the point right now. "The ear," he said. "You look at the ear?" I looked at the ear. "And?" She glanced at the calf, who was standing in the wagon with the particular resignation of an animal that has learned not to expect much. "The ear droops because it's tired, not because anything's wrong with it." Oscar was quiet for a moment. "You know this or you feel this?" Mara thought about it honestly, the way she had learned to think about things since Thomas died, without the room to dress up uncertainty as confidence. "Both," she said. "Maybe more feel than know." He nodded again, differently this time. "In the old country," he said, tapping his cane on the wagon wheel, "my father say, the animal that nobody wants, sometimes it is because nobody look right." He helped her finish securing the gate. "You look right," he said. "We see." The boy appeared 3 days later. His name was Danny Puit, and he was 12 years old, and he had been sent by his mother on some errand to the Callaway store and had taken a long way around, the way 12-year-old boys take long ways around. And the long way around had brought him past the Ellison property, where he had stopped at the fence to look at the calf in the south pasture. Mara found him there that afternoon when she came out to check on the water. "You can come in if you want," she said. He looked startled, then came over the fence in the way of boys who climb fences before they think about whether they should. He stood at a respectful distance from the calf and looked at it with the particular concentration of a child who is seeing something he finds genuinely interesting. "She's sick?" he said. Mara said. "And no, just thin." "Blackidge said he was already dead." "Blackidge says a lot of things." Danny looked at her sidelong, the way children look at adults who say what other adults usually only think. "My papa says Blackidge knows more about cattle than anybody in the county." "Your papa might be right," Mara said. "Knowing about cattle and being right about every cattle are different things." Danny thought about this with the visible effort of a boy trying to hold two ideas in his head at once. "What are you going to call him?" Mara looked at the calf. She had been thinking about this, as a matter of fact, in the small hours of the morning when the arithmetic of the coffee tin had kept her awake, and she had needed something else to think about. "Ember," she said. Danny tried the word. "Like a fire that's going out?" "Like a fire that's still there," she said. "Just quiet." The next 6 weeks were not a redemption story in the way that people later tried to make them. They were hard and specific and full of small failures. Ember did not rally dramatically. He improved the way things improve when you stop making them worse and start making them slightly better. Incrementally, unevenly, with setbacks that felt like signs and recoveries that felt like luck. Mara fed him on the milk from the one cow she'd managed to keep, mixed with the kind of supplemental mash that Oscar had described from memory in his three-directional way. She kept him in the barn at night where the temperature was forgiving and moved him to the south pasture during the day where the grass, scraggly as it was, offered things that barn hay didn't. She sat with him some evenings. Not in a sentimental way, not in a talking to animals way, but in the way that you sit near something you've decided to pay attention to, learning its rhythms, its variations, the specific language of its good days and bad days. She was not gentle with herself during this period. She noticed this. She would catch herself at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock, the coffee gone cold, the papers spread out again, and she would feel the weight of how much she had wagered on a feeling rather than a fact. And the fear was real, and she didn't look away from it. But she also didn't look away from Ember. And slowly, 3 weeks in, 4 weeks, 5, the drooping ear came up. Not all the way. Not like a flag being raised. It came up the way things came up when they had a reason to, which was unevenly and slightly, enough to notice only if you'd been watching closely enough to know what slightly looked like. Mara was watching that closely. She was at Oscar's fence the morning she noticed it, and she said nothing about it because she was not ready to say anything about it yet, but when she came home she stood at the barn door for a long time in the late afternoon light, and she felt something she had not felt since before Thomas died. Not hope exactly, which was still too expensive, but something adjacent to hope, something that had hope's shape without all of its weight. She went inside and made dinner and did the accounts, and went to sleep. She did not let herself get carried away. She was not the kind of woman who got carried away. But that night, for the first time since November, she slept the whole way through. It was Danny who said it first. He had taken to stopping by after school on the days his mother didn't need him directly home, and Mara had taken to letting him, partly because he was useful in the small ways that an extra pair of hands is always useful, and partly because she had noticed that he looked at Ember the way she looked at Ember, which is to say, carefully, with something personal at stake. He was leaning on the fence post one afternoon in early January, watching Ember move across the pasture, and he said without preamble, the way children say things they've been thinking for longer than they let on, "He's different than when you brought him." "Yes," Mara said. "Blackidge wouldn't recognize him." "No," she said. "He wouldn't." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Ellison? Hmm? Do you think you were right to buy him?" She considered the question honestly, because Danny was the kind of boy who deserved honest answers. "I think," she said slowly, "that when everybody agrees something is worthless, it's worth at least one person looking twice." Danny turned this over. "Even if they're right?" "Even then," she said. "At least you looked." The sun was going down behind the ridge, and the pasture was going copper and gray, and Ember was at the far fence, his ear up, his coat beginning, finally, to show the shine that a healthy animal shows when it has been given what it needs. Mara watched him. She was already thinking about spring, about what spring required, about what spring might make possible. She was already, though she wouldn't have called it this yet, planning. Spring came to the Ellison homestead. The way it always came to that part of the country, not all at once, not with any kind of announcement, but in pieces. A warmer morning here, a longer afternoon there, the ground softening in the low spots first, and the ridge staying hard for another 2 weeks after that. Mara noticed spring the way she noticed most things now, practically, with an eye toward what it required of her rather than what it offered. What it required, this particular spring, was a decision she had been turning over all winter like a stone in her pocket. Ember was healthy. There was no longer any question about that. The drooping ear was fully upright now, and had been since February. He had put on weight in a way that was steady rather than sudden, the kind of weight that comes from consistent good feed and room to move rather than from being pushed. And the result was an animal that looked increasingly like something other than the charity case she had paid $25 for at the back of the Callaway pen. He was not beautiful in the way that Blackidge's cattle were beautiful. He did not have the groomed, deliberate perfection of animals that had been selected for appearance as much as anything else. He was angular in places, broader through the chest than the standard proportions called for, with a way of holding his head that was attentive without being skittish. Oscar had come over to look at him in March and had stood at the pasture fence for a long time without saying anything, which with Oscar meant more than most men's speeches. "Well," Mara said finally. "Well," Oscar agreed. "That's not a lot of information, Oscar." He tapped his cane against the bottom fence rail. "You know what my father breed? Not the best animals. He breed the animals that do well in bad years." He paused. "In good years, every animal does well. You don't learn anything in good years." Mara looked at Ember moving across the pasture. "What does that have to do with him?" "He grew up on your land," Oscar said. "Your land is not good land. Your grass is marsh grass. Your water comes and goes. You have no shelter on the north side." He paused again. "And he is fine. Better than fine." Mara was quiet for a moment. "You think it means something?" "I think everything means something," Oscar said. "The question is only whether you have sense enough to read it." He picked up his cane and started back toward the fence gate. "The breeding question," he said, without turning around. "You have thought about it?" "Every day for 3 months," she said. "And?" She didn't answer immediately, because the answer was still forming, still finding its shape. Not the expensive way, she said. Not the obvious way. Oscar nodded once, still not turning around. No, he said. Not the obvious way. The obvious way, in the Callaway Valley in that era, was to breed your cow to the best credentialed bull you could access, which meant, in practical terms, one of Blackidge's bulls, at a fee that Mara could not afford and would not have paid even if she could. Blackidge's bulls were famous. They had papers going back 3 generations. They had produced 2 county champions. Every serious rancher in the valley had bred into that bloodline at least once, and the result was that the valley's cattle, broadly speaking, all looked somewhat like each other. Heavy, smooth, show-ring ready, bred for the eye of a judge on a dry summer day in a well-maintained pen. Bred, Mara had noticed, for conditions that were not always the conditions you actually had. She had been watching the valley's herds for 2 years now, first beside Thomas, then alone, with the kind of attention that comes from having nothing to lose by paying attention. She had watched which animals struggled in the dry months. She had watched which ones lost condition when the feed store prices went up and supplemental feed became a luxury. She had watched, specifically, which ones seemed to require constant management and which ones seemed to manage themselves. Blackidge's cattle were magnificent in a controlled environment. They required a controlled environment. That was the thing nobody said out loud. The bull she had in mind was not magnificent. He belonged to a man named Walt Cutter, who ran a modest operation 12 miles east of the valley floor, and who had acquired the bull some years back from a Nebraska outfit that had since gone under. The bull had no papers anyone had bothered to preserve. He was not large by county fair standards. I was not the kind of animal you pointed at when you wanted to impress someone. He was, however, the only bull Mara had seen that looked completely comfortable standing in a half-dried pasture in August. She had noticed him from the road 2 summers ago, when she and Thomas had been driving past the Cutter place. Thomas hadn't looked twice. Mara had looked 4 times, and then spent the rest of the drive thinking about why something about that animal bothered her in the way that things bother you when they don't fit the category you put them in. She had put him in the category of unremarkable, and then he had kept not fitting. She rode out to the Cutter place on a Tuesday. Walt Cutter was a man of about 60, who had the look of someone who had spent 50 of those years outside and didn't particularly feel the need to talk about it. He heard her out. He looked at her with the expression of a man deciding whether a question is serious. "You want to breed to Chester," he said, "if that's his name." "That's his name." He scratched the back of his neck. "Can I ask why?" "Because he does well on bad pasture," she said. "And I've got bad pasture." Cutter thought about this. "Most folks want the Blackidge line," he said. It wasn't an argument. It was more like a man confirming that he understood the world correctly. "Most folks," Mara said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but related to one. "Fee's $8, he said, "or I can take it in kind if you've got eggs or milk to spare." She paid the $8. She didn't have eggs or milk to spare. The breeding went quietly, unremarkably, with none of the drama that the valley's ranching community would later try to retroactively attach to it. Mara brought Ember to the Cutter place. The business was conducted. She brought Ember home. Oscar came by 3 days later and she told him, and he nodded in the particular way that meant he had already thought of this possibility and was not surprised but was nonetheless satisfied. Danny was the one who asked the question straight out. He was helping her mend the south fence in early April, the 2 of them working in companionable silence the way they had learned to work, and he said, without looking up from the wire, "What if it doesn't work?" "What if what doesn't work?" "The breeding. What if the calf isn't... What if it's just normal?" Mara pulled the wire tight and secured it before she answered. "Then I have a normal calf," she said, "which is better than no calf." "But you're hoping for more than normal." She looked at him. He was 12, going on 13, and he had the quality that certain children have of asking the questions that adults have agreed not to ask each other. "Yes," she said. "I'm hoping for more than normal." "Why?" She sat back on her heels. "Because normal isn't going to save this place," she said. "Normal isn't going to pay the note to Kessler Bank. Normal isn't going to make anyone in this valley look twice at what I'm doing." She paused. "I need something real. Not something that looks real, something that is real." Danny absorbed this. "What's the difference?" he said. "About 40 years," Mara said, "and most of the cattle in this valley." The calf was born on a night in late November when the temperature dropped faster than the forecast suggested it would, which was the kind of thing that happened in that country and which Mara had learned to prepare for by preparing for everything and hoping for the best and not being surprised when the best wasn't what arrived. She was in the barn when it happened. She had been sleeping in 45-minute intervals for 3 days, the way you sleep when you're waiting for something. And when the moment came, she was awake and present and doing the things that needed doing without drama, because drama was a luxury for people who had someone to perform it for. The calf was born healthy. She knew it immediately, not from any single sign, but from the accumulation of signs that you learn to read when you've been paying close attention for long enough. The way he came into the world with something that was already, even in those first minutes, less like confusion and more like assessment. The way he found his feet. The particular quality of his alertness. She named him Granite, not for what he looked like, because he didn't look like granite. He was dark and soft and looked, in those first hours, like most calves look, which is to say, slightly stunned by existence. She named him Granite for what she intended him to be, for the quality she had seen in his mother and was choosing to believe he had inherited, for the hardness that comes not from never being soft, but from being soft in the right places and firm in the ones that matter. She told Danny the next morning over the fence. He vaulted over without being invited, which she had stopped trying to prevent months ago, and stood at the barn door looking at the calf with the expression of a boy seeing something he doesn't have words for yet. Granite, he said. Yes. That's a serious name. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Do you think he's going to be... Do you think you were right? I think it's too early to know, she said. And I think we're going to find out. What they found out, over the next year and a half, arrived the same way all real discoveries arrive. Not in a moment of sudden revelation, but in the slow accumulation of evidence that keeps pointing the same direction until you can't look away from where it's pointing. Granite grew. He grew differently than the cattle around him grew. He grew without the kind of supplemental push that the valley's prize animals required. The expensive feed additives, the carefully managed grazing rotation, the veterinary interventions that the larger ranches budgeted for the way other businesses budgeted for equipment maintenance. He grew on the Ellison pasture, which was still the same scraggly, inconsistent, low-prestige land it had always been, and he grew as though the land suited him, as though the specific challenges of that land were not obstacles but conditions he had been designed, at some fundamental level, to handle. By his first summer he was visibly larger than expected. Not dramatically, not in the way that made people stop and stare, but measurably, to anyone who was paying attention. By his second summer, the measurements were harder to ignore. Oscar came by every few weeks with the specific casualness of a man who is not making a point of coming by. He would lean on the fence and look at Granite for a while and then say something like, "The shoulder angle is good," or "He holds his weight well in the heat," or, on one occasion that Mara marked in her memory as significant, simply, "Hum good or hum bad," she said. I have not seen this in a while," Oscar said. Seen what? He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding how much to say. An animal that looks like it was built for a specific purpose, he said finally. Not for a show ring, for here, for this. He gestured with his cane at the pasture, the low hills, the irregular ground. You understand the difference? Yes, Mara said. The valley people, they will not understand right away. No, she said, they won't. That is fine, Oscar said. Let them not understand. The land will explain it eventually. He was right about the land explaining it. He was also right about the timeline, which was longer and harder than Mara would have preferred. The drought started the summer Granite turned 2. It didn't announce itself as a drought immediately, because droughts rarely do. It started as a dry spring, which was not unusual. It continued as a hot June, which happened. It became something more serious by July, when the creek that fed the north pasture of the Blackidge operation dropped to a level that required supplemental watering, and something genuinely alarming by August, when 2 of the smaller ranches in the valley began selling animals they couldn't afford to keep because the cost of supplemental feed had outpaced what they could cover. Mara watched this from her side of the fence, which was literally her side of a fence. The Ellison property bordered the Alderman brothers' land on the east, and she could see from her barn door that the Alderman pasture had gone from thin to bare in a matter of 3 weeks. Her pasture had not gone bare. It was not lush. It had never been lush. But the particular mix of marsh grass and native scrub that grew on the low-lying portions of the Ellison land was, it turned out, more drought-tolerant than anyone had given it credit for being, because nobody had thought it worth giving credit to in the first place. And Granite, who had grown up eating it, who had built his muscle and his bone on it, continued to hold his condition in a way that required Mara to look at him several times a day just to confirm she was seeing what she was seeing. He was fine, not performing fine, actually fine. She was aware that this was significant. She was also aware that significant things had a way of not staying private in small valleys, and that the moment people noticed what was happening on the Ellison pasture, the calculus of her situation would change in ways she couldn't entirely predict. She was right about that, too. The first person from outside to notice was Danny, which didn't count because Danny noticed everything related to Granite as a matter of personal devotion at this point. The second was one of the Alderman brothers, James, who came over the fence on a Monday morning in late August to ask if she had any hay she could sell. He was 45 years old, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has had to eat something he would have preferred not to eat. "I can spare some," Mara said. "How much do you need?" "Whatever you can let go." He was looking past her at Granite in the south pasture, and she could see the specific quality of his attention, the attention of a rancher seeing something unexpected. "Your bull," he said. "Yes." "He's holding up well." "He is." James Alderman was quiet for a moment. "What are you feeding him?" "What's there?" Mara said. He looked at her to see if she was joking. She wasn't. "That's—" He stopped. "That's marsh grass and scrub out there." "I know what it is," she said. "He's always eaten it. He knows how to eat it." James looked at Granite for another long moment. Then he looked at the hay barn. "I'll pay fair price for the hay," he said. "I know you will," Mara said. She sold him a third of what she had. She would have sold more, but she wasn't going to be left short, because she had learned by now that being left short for the sake of someone else's approval was a transaction that always cost more than it looked like on the surface. After he left, she stood at the south fence for a while. She was thinking about what Oscar had said. The land will explain it eventually. She thought the land was starting to explain it. She was not prepared quite yet, for who else was about to start listening? Victor Blackidge came to understand what was happening on the Ellison property, the same way powerful men usually come to understand things that threaten their position, through someone else's report, delivered with a casualness that was meant to conceal its alarm and mostly failed. The someone else was his ranch foreman, a lean, unhappy man named Gil Pruitt, who was, in fact, Danny's uncle, a connection Mara would not learn about until later, and which would explain a number of things. Gil had seen Granite at the county scale in that September, where ranchers brought animals for weight verification ahead of the fall market. He had not said anything then. He had looked. He had done the math in his head the way men who've worked cattle for 30 years do math in their heads. Weight relative to age, condition relative to season, the specific geometry of an animal that has been grown right versus one that has been grown expensive. And he had arrived at a number that didn't fit what he thought he knew about the Ellison operation. He brought the number to Blackidge that evening. Blackidge did not believe it. "You sure about the age?" he said. "Check the registry she filed. 2 years and 4 months. And the weight?" "Stepped off the scale myself after she did." Blackidge sat with this for a moment. "What's he bred from?" "That's the part," Gil said, and here his voice took on a quality that was somewhere between reluctant and confused. "That doesn't make sense." "Tell me anyway." "Ember. That scraggly heifer she bought at the Callaway auction 2 years back. Bred to Walt Cutter's bull, Chester." Silence. "Chester," Blackidge said. "Yes, sir." "The Nebraska bull with no papers." "The same." Blackidge stood up and went to the window and looked out at his own pasture, where his own cattle, certified, documented, expensive, and currently costing him more to maintain than he would have preferred to admit, were standing in the drying grass looking like what they were, animals that had been bred for a world that was not currently available. "How's she keeping him?" "On the marsh ground, from what I can see. South pasture, mostly." "That land's worthless." "The bull doesn't seem to know that," Gil said. It was as close as Gil Pruitt ever came to making a joke, and Blackidge didn't laugh, and the silence in the room after it settled was a particular kind of silence, the silence of a man recalculating. He turned from the window. "Keep an eye on it," he said. "Yes, sir." And don't talk about it. Gil nodded and left, and Blackidge stood at the window for another few minutes, and what was happening behind his eyes during those minutes was something that the people who knew him best would have recognized as the specific expression of a man who has just seen something he doesn't want to be true and is deciding how to make sure it stays that way. Plus, what Blackidge did not know, could not have known, because he had not been paying attention to Mara Ellison in the way that he should have been paying attention, which was carefully, was that Mara had already been thinking 3 steps ahead of where he was. She had known, from the day Granite stepped off that scale, that the drought was changing the conversation. She had known that the valley's ranchers, who had spent years looking past her property on the way to the Blackidge operation, were going to start asking questions about what was happening on the Ellison land. She had known that those questions were coming faster than she was ready for, and she had been spending the autumn not on the fence admiring Granite's progress, but at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, the coffee cold, the papers spread out, working through what she intended to do when the questions arrived. Danny came by on a Friday afternoon in October and found her in this posture, elbows on the table, papers around her, the particular focused expression that he had learned meant she was somewhere he shouldn't interrupt. He sat down across from her and waited. After a while she looked up. "You're quiet," she said. "You're thinking," he said. "I know not to talk when you're thinking." "Who taught you that?" "You did," he said. "Mostly by the way you look at people who interrupt you." She almost smiled. "I'm trying to figure out timing," she said. "Timing for what?" "The championship, the county livestock show. I'm thinking about entering Granite." Danny sat very still. "Really?" "Yes." "Against Blackidge's bulls." "Against whoever enters," she said, "including Blackidge's bulls." Danny processed this. "He's going to hate that," he said. "Yes," Mara said. "He is. He's going to do something about it." Mara looked at him. Looked at this boy who was almost 14 now, and who had spent 2 years watching and learning and thinking alongside her, and she felt something that was adjacent to pride, not in herself but in him, in the quality of mind that had led him to that conclusion without her having to draw a map. "Yes," she said, "he probably will." "Are you scared?" She thought about this honestly. "Some," she said. "But less than I was scared of Thomas dying and the bank taking the land and Ember not making it to spring." She picked up her coffee, found it cold, and set it back down. "After you've been through the things that actually break you, the things that might break you get a little smaller." Danny looked at the papers on the table. "What do you need me to do?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Keep coming by," she said. "Keep doing what you're doing. Granite knows you. Animals do better when they know the people around them." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that would stay with Mara for a long time after. "Mrs. Ellison, when Blackidge was at the auction that day, the day you bought Ember, did you know what you were doing?" She thought about it the way she thought about things that deserved honest answers. "I knew what I was seeing," she said. "I didn't know what I was starting." He nodded slowly, understanding this in the way that young people understand things that they'll only fully appreciate much later. Outside the window, the sun was going down behind the western ridge, and the pasture was going gray, and somewhere out in the dimming light, Granite was doing what he did at the end of every day, standing at the south fence, head up, perfectly still, looking at whatever it is that cattle look at when they look like they know something. Mara watched him from the window. The drought was not over. The note to Kessler Bank was not settled. Blackidge had not looked at the Ellison property yet with the full attention of a man who considers something a threat. The county championship was 8 months away, and the road between here and there was not a road anyone had cleared for her. None of that had changed. But Granite was standing in the field in the fading light, holding his condition like it cost him nothing, on land that had eaten 3 other ranchers' animals this same summer, and Mara Ellison was standing at her kitchen window, watching him with the particular expression of a woman who has stopped being surprised by her own instincts. She had been right about the ear. She had been right about the pasture. She had been right about Walt Cutter's unremarkable bull with no papers and a name like Chester. The valley didn't know it yet. Blackidge didn't know it yet. The Kessler Bank didn't know it yet. But she knew it, and Oscar knew it, and Danny was beginning to know it. And somewhere out in the marsh grass at the end of the south pasture, a dark bull with a serious name was standing in the last light of an October evening, knowing it most of all. 8 months is a long time to wait for something and a short time to prepare for it, and Mara lived those 8 months in both ways simultaneously, the waiting slow and grinding, the preparation never feeling like enough. She filed the entry paperwork for the Callaway County Livestock Championship in November, standing at the clerk's window in the county building with Granite's registration documents and $8 in entry fees and the specific expression of someone who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it just because the clerk is looking at her the way this particular clerk was looking at her, which was with the mild bewilderment of a man who has processed 1,000 entries and does not remember the last time a widow from the marshland came through his window. Ellison, he said, reading the form. Yes. Thomas Ellison's place. My place, she said. Yes. He stamped it without further comment. She took her copy and left. She was halfway down the steps when she heard her name and turned to find Gil Pruitt coming out of the building behind her, which told her immediately that Gil Pruitt had been inside that building for a reason other than any obvious county business, and that the reason had something to do with the window she had just been standing at. Mrs. Ellison, he said, and his voice had the careful quality of a man delivering a message he didn't write. Mr. Pruitt. He came down the steps and stopped 2 below her, which put them at eye level, which she suspected was intentional. Mr. Blackidge asked me to pass something along, he said. Did he? He'd like to discuss the bull, Granite. He paused. He said to tell you he's prepared to make a serious offer, a fair one. Mara looked at him for a moment. Tell Mr. Blackidge I appreciate him thinking of me, she said. Gil waited. That's the whole message, she said. Something moved in Gil's expression. Not quite discomfort, but not far from it. He's going to come himself if you don't. That's his choice to make, Mara said. Have a good afternoon, Mr. Pruitt. She walked to where she'd tied the horse and rode home, and did not spend the evening worrying about it, or at least she spent as little of the evening worrying about it as she could manage, which was less than she would have preferred. Blackidge came himself 11 days later. She had known he would. She had been thinking about what to say and had arrived, over those 11 days, at the conclusion that what she was going to say was probably less important than how she was going to say it, and what she was going to say was no. He rode in on a Tuesday morning when the sky had the low, white look of a winter that hasn't committed to anything yet, and he tied his horse at the fence post with the manner of a man tying his horse at his own fence post, and he walked to the barn where Mara was working and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, which was the concession he made to the fact that this was her barn and not his. Mrs. Ellison. Mr. Blackidge. He looked around the barn with the eyes of a man appraising property, which was how he looked at most things. Mind if I see the bull? He's in the south pasture. They walked to the south pasture. Granite was at the far end, and they stood at the fence and watched him for a while. And Mara watched Blackidge watching Granite, and what she saw in Blackidge's face was something she had not expected to see quite so plainly. A kind of hunger. The hunger of a man who has spent 40 years trusting his own eye and is now looking at something his eye is telling him is significant and his pride is telling him shouldn't be. He's good, Blackidge said finally. It was not a compliment. It was an assessment delivered the way a banker delivers an appraisal, without effect, because the number is the number regardless of how you feel about it. I know, Mara said. What do you want for him? He's not for sale. Blackidge looked at her. Everything's for sale at the right number, he said. Not unkindly. It was simply what he believed. Not this, Mara said. He was quiet for a moment. He put his hat back on, which Mara noted. You're planning to enter him in the county show. I already filed the entry. I know you did. He looked at Granite again. I'm going to tell you something honestly, Mrs. Ellison, because I think you deserve honesty even if we haven't always been on good terms. She waited. The show is politics as much as it's cattle, he said. You know that. I've heard that. The judges know the operations. They know the bloodlines. They know the histories. He paused. A bull from the Ellison marshland with no documented lineage beyond 1 generation, with 2 parents I watched every day of their lives, Mara said, is going to face a harder road than you think, he finished, as though she hadn't spoken. Maybe, she said. That's never stopped me before. Blackidge looked at her for a long moment. She could see him recalibrating, could see the precise moment when he moved from trying to buy something to trying to decide what kind of problem he was dealing with. I'll give you $400, he said. $400 was the mortgage. $400 was the Kessler note, the whole thing, paid off, finished. Mara felt it land. She would have been a fool not to feel it. No, she said. 500. Mr. Blackidge. He stopped. I know what you're offering, she said. I know exactly what it would do for me. And no, not this. Something hardened in his face. Not anger, exactly. Something colder than anger. Something more deliberate. All right, he said. He picked up the fence rail with one hand, a proprietary gesture he probably didn't notice he was making. I hope the show goes well for you. He walked back to his horse and rode out, and Mara stood at the south fence watching him go, and she was aware that what had just happened was not an ending but a beginning, that the man riding away from her property was not a man who had accepted a no, but a man who had decided what to do about one. The rumors started within 2 weeks. She heard the first one from Danny, who heard it at the feed store, where feed store rumors had a particular velocity, because the men who stood at the counter had time to talk and an audience to talk to. The rumor was that Granite was undersized for his age, that the numbers Mara had filed with the county were inaccurate, that she had registered him younger than he was to make his growth appear more remarkable. It was a specific kind of lie, specific enough to sound like something someone might know, not so specific that it could be easily disproved. The kind of lie that is designed not to be believed outright, but to make people wonder, to introduce a note of doubt into conversations that would otherwise not have had one. Mara heard it and felt the particular cold fury of someone who has been lied about in a way they can't immediately correct, because correcting it requires treating it as something worth correcting, which gives it a weight it doesn't deserve. Who said it first? She asked Danny. I don't know, he said. It was just there, like it came from everywhere at once. She knew what that meant. She had grown up in a valley. She had lived among people who talked, and she knew that rumors that arrive fully formed from multiple directions at the same time do not arise naturally. They are seeded. She went to Oscar. He was sitting on his porch when she arrived, which was where he sat most mornings, and he looked at her face and said, I heard. Already. Small valley, he said. Sit down. She sat. Tell me what you want to do, he said. I want to go to the county office and pull Granite's registration and put it in front of every man in that feed store. Yes, Oscar said. And then what? She stopped. And then they say the papers are wrong, he said, not unkindly. And then you go get more papers. And then they say something else. This is how it works, Mara. You cannot argue with a river. You can only not drown in it. So I do nothing. You do the only thing that matters, he said. You get that bull to the show, and you let the judges look at him. She was quiet for a moment. And if Blackidge has gotten to the judges? Oscar was quiet for a moment in return. Then we have a bigger problem, he said. But let us find out if we have that problem before we solve it. The second thing Blackidge did was more serious. There was a man named Harold Fitch who served on the county livestock board, a body of 5 men who had no formal authority over the championship show, but had a great deal of informal influence over how it was organized, who the judges were, and what the entry standards required. Harold Fitch had borrowed money from Blackidge twice in the past decade, which was not a secret, and which meant that Harold Fitch's relationship with Blackidge was the kind of relationship that is described as friendship, but functions more like obligation. Fitch came to Mara's property on a Thursday with a clipboard and an official-looking document that turned out, when she read it, to be a request for additional documentation of Granite's lineage, specifically verified records from the Nebraska operation, where Chester, the sire's sire, had originated. The Nebraska operation had been out of business for 7 years. You know those records don't exist anymore, Mara said. She was standing in the yard and she had not offered him coffee, which was a choice she had made before he arrived. The board just wants to ensure consistency and documentation across all entries, Fitch said, reading from somewhere slightly above her head. Which other entries have been asked for 3-generation sire documentation? He didn't answer that. Mr. Fitch, she said, if you disqualify my entry on the basis of records that don't exist for reasons having nothing to do with my animal, I will take that to the county commissioner. In writing. With a list of every entry in the past 5 years that was accepted with less complete documentation than what I've already provided. He looked at her then, looked at her directly for the first time since he'd arrived. I know what you're doing, she said, and I know who asked you to do it, and I'm telling you clearly, my entry stands or I make this loud enough that the entire county hears what the livestock board is being used for. Fitch left without the additional documentation. She filed a written statement with the county commissioner's office the next morning anyway, because she had learned, from Thomas's death, from the bank, from Blackidge at the auction, and Blackidge at the fence, and Blackidge's men in the feed store, that the people who made their moves quietly were counting on you to respond quietly, and that the most disruptive thing you could do to a quiet campaign was to refuse to play by its rules. The county commissioner, a man named Aldous Parks, who had known Thomas Ellison, and who was the kind of official who had kept his position for 20 years by being genuinely impossible to push around, read the statement and called her into his office the following week and said, "Mrs. Ellison, is there anything specific you want me to do with this, or did you just want me to have it?" "Just have it," she said, "for now." Parks looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. "You're playing a longer game than most people I deal with," he said. "I'm playing the only game I can afford," she said. He nodded slowly. "Entry stands," he said, "for what it's worth coming from me." "It's worth something," she said. "Thank you." The third thing Blackidge did, Mara did not find out about until later, and it was the one that came closest to working. He approached Walt Cutter. Cutter, who had sold her the breeding rights to Chester for $8 and a handshake, and who was not a man who thought much about the downstream consequences of his business transactions, was offered $400. The same number Blackidge had first offered Mara, which said something about how he valued things, to sign a statement saying that Chester's breeding records had been misrepresented and that the registration Mara had filed was, to the best of his knowledge, inaccurate. $400 was more money than Cutter usually saw in 6 months. He came to Mara the next morning. She was at the kitchen table, not the coffee cold and papers kind of sitting, but the deliberate kind. She had been expecting movement from Blackidge and had been trying to prepare for directions she hadn't anticipated. And she heard the knock and opened the door and saw Cutter standing on the step with his hat in both hands and the expression of a man who has done something decent at some cost to himself. "He came to me," Cutter said. "I figured he would," Mara said. "Offered me a lot of money." "I know." "I didn't take it." She looked at him. "I appreciate that," she said. "More than I can say right now." Cutter shifted his hat from one hand to the other. "I want to say something," he said. "About Chester." "All right. When you came out to breed Ember, when you told me it was because Chester did well on bad pasture, I thought you were making the best of a bad situation." He paused. "I didn't think you were right. I thought you were being sensible about being poor." He paused again, longer. "I was wrong." Mara was quiet for a moment. "You came 12 miles to tell me that," she said. "I came 12 miles to tell you that and to say if Blackidge sends anyone else to my property, I'll be writing to the commissioner myself." She almost said something. Instead, she held out her hand, and he shook it, and he left, and she stood in the doorway watching his wagon go down the lane, and she felt the specific weight of having someone in your corner at the moment when the corners are being tested. The show was in the second week of June. The valley had not recovered from the drought. The spring rains had been merciful, but not generous, and the ranches that had sold animals to survive the winter were still thin, still rebuilding, still carrying the particular exhaustion of people who have spent 8 months managing crisis rather than managing cattle. The championship show was smaller than usual. 3 of the operations that typically entered had nothing to enter. 2 had not survived at all. Blackidge entered 2 bulls. Both were fine animals, on papers going back 4 generations, show records, the whole history of deliberate expensive breeding that he had spent 40 years constructing. They were exactly what they looked like. The best that money could produce when money had been spent thoughtfully and consistently over a long time. Mara drove in with Granite in the back of a borrowed stock trailer, Danny beside her on the bench, Oscar having said his goodbyes the night before because the trip was too far for his hip, and he had said, with the particular dignity of a man who knows his limitations without apologizing for them, "Tell me when you come back." "I will," Mara said. "Tell me the number," he said. "I want the number." She had squeezed his hand, which was not something she did habitually, and he had looked at her hand on his, and then at her face and nodded once, and that was their goodbye. The showgrounds were loud in the way that outdoor county events are loud. animals and equipment, and people who haven't seen each other since last season and are catching up at full volume. Mara moved through it with the focused calm of someone who has used up her nerves on the preceding 8 months and has arrived at the actual event in a state of strange clarity. Danny led Granite to the preparation area. People looked. Not all of them. Not dramatically, not in a way that stopped the noise or drew a crowd. But Mara noticed the specific quality of the looking, the second glances, the men who said something to the man next to them after Granite passed. She had expected some of this. She had not entirely expected the quantity of it. "They're looking at him," Danny said quietly. "I see that. Is that good?" "It means he looks like something worth looking at," Mara said. "Whether it's good depends on who's doing the looking." Blackidge was there. Of course he was there. He was at the east end of the preparation area with Gil Pruitt and 2 other men, and he saw Mara and Granite come in, and he looked at Granite with the same expression he'd had at the south fence. That hunger and that calculation running simultaneously beneath a face that was practiced at revealing neither. And then he looked at Mara, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything, and that was its own kind of conversation. The judging panel was 3 men from outside the county. The commissioner had arranged this in the weeks after Mara's visit to his office, citing a general interest in unbiased evaluation, and Blackidge had objected to the change through Harold Fitch, and Parks had listened to the objection and thanked Fitch for raising it and done nothing about it. Mara had not known Parks would do this. She was grateful in a way that she filed carefully away without making too much of it. The 3 judges were a livestock assessor from the neighboring county, an agricultural college examiner, and a retired rancher from 2 states north whose name Mara didn't recognize, but whose reputation, according to Oscar, was for caring about nothing except what an animal could do in real conditions. That last one mattered. The judging took most of the morning. Mara watched from the rail, not nervously, or not only nervously, but with the attention she brought to everything she cared about, completely, noting everything, letting nothing blur past, because blurring past was how you missed the thing that turned out to matter. Blackidge's first bull went through and was excellent. She allowed herself to see that clearly. It was excellent the way something is excellent when everything has gone right for a long time. Polished, composed, the result of long intention. The judges made notes. The crowd murmured the murmur of people seeing what they expected to see. Granite went in 20 minutes later. Danny walked him in, and Mara watched Danny's back as he went through the gate and thought, "He's steady, he's good, he's been ready for this without knowing he was getting ready." The noise around the ring changed when Granite entered, not silenced, nothing so dramatic. But the frequency of the murmuring changed, the way a room's sound changes when something enters it that the room wasn't entirely expecting. Granite moved the way he always moved, attentively, without agitation, with a quality that was hard to name precisely, but that Mara had been watching for 2 years, and that Oscar had named better than anyone else when he said, "An animal built for here." The judges looked. They looked for a long time. The retired rancher from 2 states north walked the full perimeter of Granite twice, which was once more than he had walked Blackidge's bull, and Mara watched him do it and felt the thing she had been carrying for 8 months shift slightly in her chest. Not released, not yet, but shifted, like something that has been held in one position too long finally moving. The scoring took 40 minutes. Danny came out through the gate and stood beside Mara at the rail, and neither of them said anything. He was 14 now, and tall enough that she didn't have to look down at him anymore. And he stood with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the judge's table, and she stood with her hands on the rail and her eyes on the same place, and the sun was high, and the grounds were loud, and the 40 minutes were the longest 40 minutes she could remember since the night Granite was born. Harold Fitch, she learned later, approached the judge's table once during the deliberation. She did not see it happen. She was at the water trough with Granite. But Danny saw it, and Danny described it to her afterward with the specific detail of a boy who had learned to notice things. Fitch walking to the table, leaning in, saying something to the agricultural examiner, the examiner listening, nodding, and then waiting for Fitch to leave before saying something to the other 2 judges. Whatever Fitch said, whatever intervention he attempted, it did not produce the result Blackidge had been counting on. The announcer called the results from a raised platform at the east end of the grounds. Reserve champion first, one of Blackidge's bulls, which produced the sustained applause of the expected. Grand champion second. Mara heard her name before she heard the rest of it. heard Ellison, and heard the sound of the crowd doing the particular thing that crowds do when something happens that they did not expect. Not silence, not applause, but a beat of recalibration, a collective intake that lasted maybe 2 seconds before it resolved into noise. Danny grabbed her arm. She looked at his face. She had not prepared for this part. She had prepared for everything she could think of. The rumors, the documentation fight, Fitch at the commissioner's office, Cutter's visit, the 8 months of arithmetic at the kitchen table. And she had not prepared for the moment of it actually happening, for the specific physical sensation of a thing you have bet everything on coming in. She walked to the platform. She accepted the ribbon. She shook 3 hands. She said what you say when you accept a thing like this in public, which is gracious and brief, because she was not going to perform her emotions in front of the man she could see at the edge of her vision, standing at the rail with Gil Pruitt, with the expression of someone watching a building they own catch fire. Blackidge did not stay for the reception, she noticed. She drove home in the late afternoon with Danny beside her and Granite in the trailer behind them, and the ribbon on the bench seat between them, and neither of them talked much for the first half of the drive, which was its own kind of fullness. The fullness of something that doesn't need to be said because it already happened. Danny picked up the ribbon at some point and looked at it and put it back down. Grand champion, he said. Yes. Twice in the last 3 years for Blackidge's operation, he said. Now once for yours. Once is enough for now, she said. He looked at her. Are you happy? He said. I can't always tell with you. She thought about this honestly. Yes, she said. But not the way I thought I'd be happy if this happened. I thought I'd feel finished. I don't feel finished. What do you feel? She watched the road. Like the first thing just happened, she said. Not the last thing. Danny was quiet for a moment. What's the next thing? I don't know yet, she said. But the valley is going to come to us now. People who wouldn't have looked at the Ellison property a year ago are going to come asking about breeding rights to granite. Is that good? It depends entirely on what we do with it, she said. She pulled onto the lane that led to the homestead, and the late sun was hitting the south pasture at the angle that made the marsh grass look almost gold, which was the angle she had come to think of as the land's best face, the face it showed when it wasn't trying to prove anything. She stopped the truck at the gate. She sat for a moment with the engine ticking. Danny, she said. Yeah. Go tell Oscar. I was out of the truck and over the fence before she finished the sentence, running toward the old man's property in the way of boys who run not because they have to, but because the news they're carrying is too large to walk with. Mara sat in the quiet truck and looked at her land. The ribbon was on the bench beside her. $400, Blackidge had offered. Then $500. The Kessler note, paid off, finished, clean. She looked at the south pasture where granite would go in the morning. She had not taken the money. She had been right not to. But she sat in the truck for another minute, just the two of them, herself and the choice she'd made, before she got out and went to let Granite into the field where he belonged. The first man came 3 days after the show. Mara was mending the east fence when she heard the wagon, and she stood up and shaded her eyes and watched it come down the lane with the specific attention of someone who has learned that unexpected arrivals are rarely neutral. The man driving it was Robert Alderman. Not James, the one who'd bought hay from her in August, but Robert, the older brother, the one who had never in Mara's memory initiated a conversation with her about anything more substantial than weather. He stopped the wagon and climbed down and stood at the fence line with his hat in his hand, which was the second time in recent memory that a man had arrived at her property holding his hat in a way that meant something. Mrs. Ellison, he said. Mr. Alderman. He looked past her at the south pasture, where granite was visible at the far end, and then he looked back at her with the expression of a man assembling words he's been rehearsing since he left his own property. I heard about the show, he said. Most people have by now. I was wrong, he said. About the bull. About what you were doing out here. He stopped. About a lot of things, I think. Mara looked at him. He was 60-something, a man who had ranched this valley his whole life, and who had never, in her observation, found it easy to be wrong. The fact that he was standing here saying it directly, rather than sending his brother or working around to it sideways, told her something she filed carefully. What do you need? She said. Not harshly, practically. He looked at the pasture again. Breeding rights to granite, he said. Whatever your terms are. I haven't set terms yet. I know. I came early because I figured others would come, and I wanted to be straight with you before there was a line. He turned his hat in his hands. I can offer fair market rate. Whatever the going fee for a champion bull, come back Friday, Mara said. I'll have terms by Friday. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He climbed into the wagon and drove out, and Mara stood at the fence watching him go and then turned back to the east fence and finished mending it, because the fence still needed mending regardless of what else was happening. She worked through the afternoon with the particular focus of someone using physical work to think, which was how she did her best thinking, hands busy, mind loose, the problem turning over at a level below active argument. By the time the sun was going down, she had the shape of something, not the details, but the shape. And she went inside and made dinner and sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread out and worked on the details until 10 o'clock. In the morning, she rode to Oscar's. I was on the porch, as he usually was, and he had coffee, which he usually had, and he poured her a cup without asking, which was the kind of small grace that people who've known each other long enough perform without thinking. She told him about Robert Alderman. Then she told him what she'd been thinking at the fence and at the kitchen table. Oscar listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interruption, with the occasional slow nod that meant he was tracking rather than agreeing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. $25, he said. $25, she said. He looked at his coffee. Because that is what you paid for Ember. Yes. And for those who have nothing left, a bale of hay, she said, or whatever they have. Oscar sat with this. Some people, he said slowly, will think you are weak or foolish. I know. Some people will try to take advantage. Probably. And you are doing it anyway. I'm doing it because of what it is, not because of how it looks, she said. If I charge what the market will bear right now, I'm doing exactly what Blackidge does. I'm using someone else's desperation to make myself comfortable. She paused. These people lost animals in the drought. Some of them lost everything. I'm not going to make them pay for that twice. Oscar looked at her over his coffee cup with the expression he sometimes had, the expression of a man who has lived a long time and has seen a great many choices made and has learned to distinguish between the choices that look noble and the choices that are. Your father, he said. What was he like? Mara looked at him, slightly surprised. Oscar did not usually ask about people who weren't present. Stubborn, she said. Fair. Not easy to live with. You are like him? My mother said so. She paused. She didn't always mean it as a compliment. Oscar nodded. $25, he said again, or a bale of hay. He set his cup down. This will be remembered longer than the championship. That's not why I'm doing it. I know, he said. That is why it will be remembered. By Friday, there were 7 men waiting, not literally waiting. They weren't lined up at the gate when she came out in the morning. But 7 men had come by or sent word or asked through intermediaries in the 3 days since Robert Alderman's visit, which was 7 times what she had expected and which told her that the drought had done more damage across the valley than the public conversation had admitted. She set up the kitchen table with the registration ledger she'd started, the terms she'd written out in the plainest language she could manage, and the coffee pot, because whatever else was happening, people sitting at a table did better with coffee. They came through the day. Some she knew well, some she knew by name only. One, a man named Creighton from the north end of the valley, she had never spoken to directly in her life. They sat across the table from her and she explained the terms and watched their faces. The $25 produced a range of expressions. Some men looked relieved. Some looked confused, the confusion of people who have been braced for a number and receive a much smaller one and aren't sure what the catch is. One man, Pete Duval, who ran 60 head on the rocky ground west of the Alderman place, looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't immediately name, and then she recognized it as shame, the specific shame of a man who knows he has been unkind and is now on the receiving end of generosity he hasn't earned. Duval had been in the pen the day she bought Ember. He had laughed. She had not forgotten. She had also not brought it here, not into this room, not into this transaction. 25, she said. Same as anyone else. He reached into his coat and put the money on the table, and she wrote his name in the ledger, and that was the whole of what passed between them on the subject, which was the right amount. The man who came with nothing was Earl Goss. She had known he was coming. James Alderman had told her, quietly, the week before, that Goss had lost his whole herd. Not reduced, not thinned, but gone, sold off animal by animal to cover feed costs and veterinary bills until there was nothing left to sell, and that Goss was staying on the land only because leaving it meant admitting to himself that 40 years of work had come to nothing, and that Earl Goss was not yet capable of admitting that. He was 68 years old, and he drove in on a wagon pulled by a horse that was too thin, which told the whole story without needing supplementation. He sat across the table and looked at the ledger and the terms written on the paper, and then looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who has worked outside for 40 years. Scarred across the knuckles, permanently dark at the creases, the kind of hands that don't look like they belong at a kitchen table. "I don't have 25, he said. He said it to the table, not to her. "What do you have?" she said. He looked up. "I've got 1 bale of good hay left in the barn," he said. "The rest is gone." Mara looked at him for a moment. "That'll do," she said. He stared at her. "Mrs. Ellison." "A bale of hay," she said. "That's the term for folks who haven't got 25. A bale of hay, or whatever they have." She turned the ledger to face him. "Write your name." He took the pen. His hand wasn't steady, and she noticed it and did not remark on it, and he wrote his name in large, careful letters, like a man who learned to write when writing was treated as something serious, and he put the pen down and pushed the ledger back. "Why?" he said. "Not why are you doing this, or why would you do this for me?" Just why, flat and quiet, the single syllable of a man who has been carrying something heavy for too long and genuinely cannot understand when someone offers to help carry it. "Because the valley needs cattle that work," she said. "Not cattle that look good in good years. If Granite's calves go to the people who can pay the most, they end up on the operations that needed them least." She paused. "That doesn't help anyone." "It would help you," he said. "It would make me more comfortable," she said. "That's different." Goss sat at the table for a moment longer than necessary, and Mara let him, because sometimes people need a moment to put something down that they've been carrying and they need you not to rush them through it. Then he stood up and picked up his hat and said, "Thomas Ellison was a lucky man," and walked out. She sat at the table after he left and looked at his name in the ledger and thought about Thomas, which she did less often now than she had in the first year, not because she had stopped missing him, but because the missing had changed its shape, had become something she carried differently, less in the front of her chest and more somewhere deeper, somewhere that didn't require constant attention. She thought he would have liked what she was doing here. She also thought he probably wouldn't have thought of it himself, and she wasn't sure whether that was a kind thought or an honest one or both. She poured the last of the coffee and looked at the ledger. 14 names by end of day. The reaction from the valley was not uniform. Nothing ever is. Some people heard what she'd done and understood it immediately, in the way that people understand things that align with what they already know to be right. These were mostly the people who'd been hurt worst by the drought, the ones who'd sold animals and lost sleep and eaten thinner, and who recognized, in Mara's terms, a person who had been in a bad place and was choosing not to use that knowledge as a weapon. Some people heard it and thought she was naive, that she was leaving money on the table, that a woman running a single widow operation on marshland had no business being charitable when she had a mortgage to finish paying. These people said these things mostly to each other, because saying them to Mara directly required a confidence that her recent history had made harder to manufacture. And some people, a smaller group, but not a small one, heard what she'd done and felt something they couldn't quite account for, a kind of discomfort that came from recognizing that the widow they had written off, laughed at, undercut, and tried to disqualify was now offering them the thing they needed most at the price they could actually pay, and that this put them in a position they had not anticipated and did not know how to be in gracefully. Pete Duval was in this group. He came back 2 weeks after the kitchen table meeting, unannounced, with a load of fence posts in the back of his wagon. Mara was at the barn when he pulled in. "I've got posts," he said. "Your east fence needs work." "I fixed the east fence." "Your south fence needs work." She looked at him. "Mr. Duval." "I was in the pen that day," he said, "when you bought the calf." "I know you were." I laughed. "I know that too." He stood with the posts in the wagon behind him, and the particular stillness of a man who has decided to say something and is going to say it regardless of how it lands. "The south fence," he said. "Let me put in the posts. You don't have to call it anything. I'm not asking for anything back. She looked at the south fence, which did in fact need work. 2 posts had been leaning for 3 weeks, and she hadn't gotten to them. I'll bring the wire, she said. They worked through the afternoon without much conversation, the kind of work that doesn't require conversation because the work itself is the conversation. And when they were done, Duval loaded the empty post-hole digger back in his wagon, and she brought out 2 cups of coffee, and they stood at the tailgate and drank them. Your calves come in next spring, he said, if everything goes the way I think it will. He nodded, looking at the south pasture where Granite was moving in the evening light. I told my son about the show, he said. He said he wants to ranch when he's grown. I told him to watch what's happening on the Ellison place. He finished his coffee. That's the only thing I've ever told him to watch. He gave her the cup back and drove out, and Mara stood at the south fence in the fading light and felt the particular complicated texture of being in a moment she hadn't planned for. Not the vindication, which she had thought about, but the quiet that came after it, the way that being right turns out to feel different than you thought it would feel when you were still fighting to prove it. Blackidge found out about the terms on a Thursday. She didn't know how. The valley was small and permeable, and information moved through it the way water moves through uneven ground, finding the lowest path. But he found out, and what happened next was not what she expected. She expected another move, another intermediary, another official with a clipboard, another rumor fed into the feed store pipeline. She had been quietly prepared for all of these, had spent part of her evenings thinking through responses the way you think through chess positions when you know the other player hasn't stopped playing. What happened instead was silence. A week of it, then 2, then a month. She mentioned it to Danny one afternoon in July when he was helping her with the water trough, and the silence had begun to feel like its own kind of information. He's not doing anything, she said. Danny looked up. Is that bad? I don't know yet, she said. It might mean he's given up. It might mean he's planning something I can't see yet. Or it might just mean he lost, Danny said. And he knows it. Mara considered this. Men like Blackidge don't usually accept that quietly, she said. Maybe he's not the same man he was before the show, Danny said, with the straightforwardness of someone who doesn't yet know that people change slower and less completely than you want them to. She didn't disabuse him of it. He'd learned that himself in time. What she found out later, from James Alderman, who heard it from someone who heard it from Gil Pruitt, which was the standard chain of valley information, was that the drought had hit the Blackidge operation harder than anyone had publicly acknowledged. The supplemental feed costs had been extraordinary. 2 of his prize breeding cows had been lost to heat stress in August. The bank he used, not the Kessler Bank, but the Harmon Bank in the next county, had called in a review of his operating line. The man who had offered her $400 and then $500, the man who had sent Gil Pruitt to the county clerk and Harold Fitch to the judge's table, the man who had tried to buy Walt Cutter's silence for $400 more, that man was dealing, quietly, and without the audience he was accustomed to performing for, with the specific humiliation of finding out that the empire you built on the assumption of good years is vulnerable in a way you never had to reckon with because the good years kept coming until they didn't. She did not feel triumphant when she heard this. She examined herself carefully on the point because she thought she ought to feel something about it. Satisfaction or justice, or at minimum the relief of knowing the threat had reduced itself. But what she actually felt was something more like tiredness, the tiredness of a long thing being over, and something that was almost sympathy, not for what Blackidge had tried to do to her, but for the experience of discovering that the thing you've built your identity around is not as solid as you needed it to be. She understood that experience. She had lived it at a kitchen table with $42.30 and a dead man's papers spread out in front of her. She didn't say any of this to anyone. Some things are private not because they're shameful, but because they're complicated in ways that conversation flattens. The calves started arriving in the spring of the following year, born on 14 different operations across the valley, and the thing that happened with them was not dramatic or sudden, but was, in its cumulative weight, more significant than the championship ribbon that was still hanging in Mara's kitchen because she hadn't found the right place to put it yet. The calves thrived. Not all of them, not uniformly. This was not a story where everything worked perfectly because the right bloodline had arrived. 2 were lost in the first month, 1 to an infection that had nothing to do with breeding, 1 to circumstances that the rancher couldn't fully account for. Earl Goss's calf had a difficult start, and Mara drove out twice to look at it. because she felt a particular responsibility toward Earl Goss's calf that she couldn't entirely explain and didn't try to. The calf made it. By summer, the pattern was visible. Granite's calves were not the largest animals in their respective operations. They were not the most visually spectacular, but they were holding condition on the valley's compromised pasture in a way that the existing bloodlines, the Blackidge-descended animals, the expensive imports, the carefully documented pedigreed stock, were not consistently managing. The retired rancher from 2 states north who had judged the championship show wrote a letter to the agricultural college in his county. The letter, which Mara didn't see until much later, described the Ellison breeding program in terms she would have found excessive if she'd read them at the time, which she didn't. What mattered was that the letter prompted a visit from an examiner the following fall, and that visit prompted another, and that the conversation that had started in a livestock pen with $25 and a sickly calf began, slowly and then less slowly, to enter a larger conversation about what cattle breeding in drought country ought to look like. None of this was fast. None of it arrived in the form that stories usually deliver their conclusions. The clear moment, the final accounting, the scene where everything is resolved. Life doesn't work that way, and Mara knew it, and had known it since the night she sat at the kitchen table with the papers and chose not to be surprised by the arithmetic. But she could see it accumulating. That was something. That was, in fact, quite a lot. Danny turned 15 that summer and had, somewhere in the preceding year, made the transition from boy who came by after school to something that didn't have an exact name but that functioned, in practical terms, like an apprentice. He was there most days. He knew the animals individually by now. Not just Granite, but the 2 cows Mara had acquired, the specific temperament of each, what each required. He had developed opinions about pasture management that were sometimes right and sometimes wrong and always thought through, which was the most you could ask of opinions. His mother had come to Mara in the spring with a directness that Mara respected. "He's going to want to stay," his mother said. "After school, I mean. For good." "I know," Mara said. "Is that something you'd take on? As a responsibility?" Mara looked at the woman across the fence from her. A woman who had sent her son on an errand 2 years ago and had him come back changed, shaped by something that had happened on the Ellison property, and who was now standing here asking about the future with the specific vulnerability of a mother trying to do right by a child whose future she can't entirely control. "I can't promise him a wage yet," Mara said. "Not a real one. What I can promise is that anything I learn, he learns. Any decision I make, I'll explain the thinking." She paused. "And in 5 years, if he's still here and still wants it, there'll be something to have." Danny's mother looked at the south pasture. "Thomas would have liked him," she said. "Yes," Mara said. "He would have." They stood at the fence for a moment in the late afternoon quiet. "All right," the woman said. "I'll tell him he can stay." Well, the thing that nobody in the valley talked about directly, but that everyone could feel by the end of that second summer, was that the conversation about cattle had changed. Not officially, not yet. There were no proclamations, no formal acknowledgments. The livestock board still functioned the same way it always had. Harold Fitch was still on it, though he had developed a noticeable habit of looking at the middle distance whenever Mara's name came up in meetings. But the practical conversation, the one that happened at the feed store counter and over fence lines and at the end of long days when ranchers compared notes the way ranchers have always compared notes, that conversation had shifted. The shift was simple. People had stopped assuming that the most expensive bloodline was the best bloodline for their specific ground. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that takes a generation to move and usually requires something catastrophic to move it at all. The drought had been catastrophic. Granite's calves had been the visible alternative. Mara had been the person who held the 2 things in the same hand and said, simply and consistently, and at some personal cost, "Look at what actually works." Robert Alderman said something to her at the county market in September that she turned over for a long time afterward. "You know what you did?" he said. They were standing at the scale house, not doing anything in particular, just 2 people at the same place at the same time. "I raised a bull," she said. "You changed what we're all raising toward," he said, "without asking permission." She thought about this. "I didn't need permission," she said. "It was my land." "That's the part that's going to stick," he said, long after everyone forgets the details. She went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table. The same table, the same chair, the same window. But the papers spread out in front of her were different papers. The Kessler note had been paid off in July, 4 years after Thomas died, paid in full without drama, a cashier's check across the counter, and a receipt she kept in the tin that used to hold $42.30. The papers in front of her now were expansion plans. Not large. She was not a woman who planned large before she'd secured the foundation, but real. A proper hay barn on the north side. Another breeding cycle with granite. A letter she'd been drafting to the agricultural examiner about a formal documentation program for the bloodline, because if granite's descendants were going to reshape the valley, she intended to make sure the reshaping was traceable. Danny came in from the barn at dusk, the way he came in from the barn at dusk these days, and stood in the doorway looking at the papers. "Planning?" he said. "Always," she said. He came in and poured himself coffee. He had started drinking coffee, which made him seem older and slightly absurd simultaneously, the way 15-year-olds often do, and sat across from her and looked at the papers. "North Barn?" he said. "North Barn," she said. "And I want to talk to you about the spring breeding schedule. I have ideas, but I want your read on the second cow's timing." He looked up. "You're asking me." "I'm asking you," she said. "You've been watching her longer than I have this month." He sat up slightly. Not visibly, not in a way he would have admitted to, but Mara noticed it, the particular adjustment of a person being asked for their real opinion for the first time and realizing they have one. "She's ready," he said. "Earlier than you're thinking. I'd put it at first week of April, not third." "Tell me why." He told her. He was right. She made a note in the ledger and he watched her write it and then looked back at his coffee with the expression of someone who is trying not to look too pleased with himself and mostly failing, which was such a young expression, such a specific 14 going on 15 expression, that she felt the full weight of how long they had both come from where they'd started. Outside the window, the south pasture was going dark, the last light gone from the marsh grass, and granite was a shape at the far fence, barely visible, present in the way that things are present when you know exactly where to look. Mara looked at the ledger. 14 names. A paid note. A north barn in the plans. A boy learning to think at the table across from her. She had paid $25 for something nobody wanted. The valley was still learning what she'd bought. The north barn went up in October. It was not a beautiful barn. Mara had not hired a crew. She couldn't afford a crew. And more than that, she had a particular resistance to paying for something that could be built by people who already had a stake in the outcome. Danny's older brother came. Walt Cutter drove in from his 12 miles with 2 of his ranch hands and a load of timber he said he'd been meaning to use for something. James Alderman showed up on the second morning without being asked, looked at what they were doing, and picked up a hammer. Robert Alderman came on the third day and did not pick up a hammer because his shoulder had been bad since the previous winter. But he ran the level and told people when things were crooked, which turned out to be a job that needed doing more often than expected. By the end of the week, there was a barn. It was slightly off square on the southeast corner, and the door on the east side had a gap at the top that let in more light than was strictly useful, and Mara looked at it when they were done with the particular expression of someone assessing work that is not perfect, but is solid and real, and built by people who had a reason to build it well. "It'll hold," Danny said. "It'll hold," she agreed. Walt Cutter stayed for supper that evening and sat at the kitchen table where the ledger lived and looked at the 14 names and said nothing about them, but looked at them long enough that Mara understood he was reading them carefully. "Chester would have got a kick out of this," he said. Mara looked at him. "The bull," he said. "I always thought he was something, just never had the setup to prove it." "You had the setup," Mara said. "You just didn't have the drought." Cutter thought about this. "That's a strange way to be grateful for a drought," he said. "I'm not grateful for the drought," she said. "I'm noting that it showed what was already true." He looked at her across the table in the way that people look at you when you've said something they're going to think about on the drive home. "Chester died in August," he said. "Thought you should know." She had not known. She sat with it for a moment. "He had a good last few years," Cutter said. "Knew he'd done something, if that means anything." "It means something," Mara said. They finished supper and he drove out in the dark and she washed the dishes and thought about Chester, the unremarkable bull with no papers and a name that didn't sound like it belonged on a champion's certificate, standing in a half-dried pasture in August, looking comfortable in conditions that were supposed to be impossible. And she thought about Ember and about the $25 and about the particular chain of unlikely things that leads from one overlooked animal to another until suddenly the valley looks different than it did. She was not a sentimental woman. She had been formed, over the past 5 years, into something that sentiment could touch but couldn't move, which was different from being cold. She felt the loss of Chester the way you feel the loss of something that mattered without your fully knowing it mattered until it was gone. She went to bed and slept the whole way through, which she could do most nights now. The second championship came the following June. It was Granite's son, not from the Valley's operations, but from Ember's second breeding, a calf Mara had kept back from the first season, a decision that Danny had argued for and that she had agreed to after 2 weeks of thinking about it. The calf's name was Ridge, which was Danny's suggestion and which Mara had accepted without comment because it was a good name and because Danny had earned the right to name something by now. Ridge was not Granite. This was the first thing Mara understood about him, and the first thing she had to adjust to, because she had been watching Granite for so long that her eye had calibrated to him specifically, and Ridge was a different animal, leaner through the shoulder, quicker in his attention, with a way of moving that was less settled than Granite's and more alert, like an animal that is always running a calculation. He was also, by the measurements she took in the spring of his second year, larger than Granite had been at the same age. She mentioned this to Oscar on a Tuesday in March. He was on the porch with his coffee and his cane and the late winter sunlight that came through the bare trees at an angle that made him look, in certain moments, exactly as old as he was, which was 74 now and feeling it in ways he occasionally mentioned and more often didn't. Larger, he said. By about 12% at the shoulder, she said. And the hindquarter development is ahead of where Granite was. Oscar drank his coffee. The conditions, he said. You have better pasture now than when Granite was growing. Some better, she said, not dramatically. Even a little better, compounded. He moved his hand in the way he moved it when he was describing something that grew over time. The base is Granite, but Ridge has the base plus the improvement. This is how bloodlines work when you do it right. Each generation has what the last one built. Mara looked at the north pasture, where Ridge was in the morning cold with steam coming off him in the way of animals that generate more heat than the air around them. I want to enter him, she said. Oscar looked at her. Of course you do, he said. You think it's too soon. I think, he said carefully, that the question is not whether he is ready. The question is whether you are ready for what happens if he wins. She looked at him. What happens if he wins? More people, Oscar said. More requests. More attention from people who want to own a piece of what you built without having built any of it themselves. He paused. And some people who will try to take it, legally, if they can. Other ways if they can't. That's already happening, she said. The agricultural college sent someone last month who spent 2 hours asking questions about the documentation program and then asked if the breeding records were publicly registered. What did you say? I said they were registered with the county, same as any livestock records, and that if they wanted to review them, they were welcome to do so at the county clerk's office during business hours. Oscar smiled, which he did rarely, and which changed his whole face when he did. You are better at this than Thomas was, he said. It was the most direct thing he had ever said about Thomas, and she felt it land in the specific way that true things land when someone you trust says them. Thomas was good at different things, she said. Yes, Oscar said. But you are here and he is not, and the valley is different because of it. That is not nothing. She went home and entered Ridge in the championship. The show was different the second time. Not in its format. It was the same grounds, the same scale house, the same platform where the announcer would stand. But the quality of attention around the Ellison entry was different. The second glances had become first glances. The murmuring that had greeted Granite's entry 2 years ago, the murmuring of people seeing something unexpected, had been replaced by a different kind of attention. The attention of people who are watching something they have already decided matters and want to see how it unfolds. Danny was 20 now. He had been 17 the year of Granite's championship, and he had grown into himself in the intervening years in the specific way that young men grow when they are given real work and real responsibility and the space to be wrong without being humiliated for it. He was not finished growing. Mara was clear-eyed about that, about the ways he still reached for certainty before he'd earned it. about the specific blind spots of someone who had learned most of what he knew in one place from one person. But he was good. He was genuinely good at this, and she had started to feel, in the past year, the particular shift of a relationship where the person you've been teaching begins to teach you things back. He led Ridge into the show ring with the composure of someone who has been in a show ring before and knows that the composure is itself part of what the judges are watching. Mara stood at the rail. Blackidge was not there. She noticed his absence before she noticed most of the other things around her, because his presence had been such a fixed feature of the showgrounds for so long that the space where he usually stood had a specific quality of empty that the rest of the crowd did not. She asked James Alderman, who was standing nearby. "He's sold," James said. She looked at him. "The operation," James said. "Not all of it. The main parcel, the breeding stock, the documentation. He sold it to an outfit from out of state, 2 months ago." He paused. "Gil Pruitt told me. Said Blackidge is keeping the house and 10 acres. The rest is gone." Mara turned back to the ring. She watched Ridge move through his paces. She had imagined, in various moods over the past few years, what it would feel like to hear this. She had imagined feeling vindicated, or satisfied, or the specific cold pleasure of watching something that tried to destroy you destroy itself instead. She had given herself permission for those feelings in the privacy of her own kitchen because she was not a saint, and she had not pretended to be. What she actually felt, standing at the rail watching Ridge in the morning light, was something quieter than any of that. Something closer to the feeling you have when a long argument ends. Not triumph, exactly, but the absence of the argument's weight, the sense of space where the resistance used to be. Blackidge had not lost to her. He had lost to the drought and to his own conviction that the way things had always been was the way things would always be. She had just happened to be standing on the other side of that conviction when it came apart. Ridge won. Not by a narrow margin. The judges, 2 of whom were new and had no history with the valley's politics, assessed him with a thoroughness that took longer than Mara expected and produced a score that made the retired rancher who judged Granite's championship, now sitting in the stands as a spectator, lean forward in his seat. Grand champion. The second time the name Ellison was called from that platform. Danny came through the gate with Ridge and found Mara at the rail, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a boy anymore. It was the expression of someone who has worked towards something and seen it arrive and is already thinking about what it means for what comes next. 2, he said. 2, she said. Granite and Ridge. Yes. He looked at the ribbon in his hand. We should call it something, he said. The bloodline, officially, for the documentation program. Mara had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it for longer than she'd told him. Ember, she said. He was quiet for a moment. For the beginning, he said. For the beginning, she said. And for what it meant. Something still there. Just quiet. Danny looked at the ribbon, and then at Ridge, and then at Mara, and something in his face did the thing that young people's faces do when they understand something for the first time at the depth at which it was meant to be understood, rather than just at the surface where it's easy. She never got to see this, he said. Ember. No, Mara said, but she's in everything that did. Oscar saw the ribbon that evening. She drove to his place on the way home because she had told him she would. The way she had told him after the first championship. I'll come back and tell you the number. She pulled in, and he was on the porch, and she got out and walked up and held the ribbon out, and he looked at it for a long moment without taking it. Then he reached out and held it by one edge, the way you hold something you want to feel the weight of. Ridge, she said. Grand champion, he said. Yes. He handed the ribbon back. Twice, he said. Twice. He sat back in his chair and looked at the yard, at the last light on the trees, at the particular late afternoon quality of a summer evening that has been warm all day and is beginning to release it. My father, he said, used to say that you know you did something real when it keeps happening after you stop pushing it. Mara sat down in the other chair, the one that had become, over 5 years of Tuesday mornings and occasional evenings, something like her chair in the particular way that places become yours, through repeated use rather than ownership. I haven't stopped pushing, she said. No, he said, but you pushed in the right direction and now it moves a little on its own. He paused. That is different. That is when you know. They sat for a while in the easy quiet of people who don't need to fill space. "Oscar," she said. "Hmm." "When I came to you after the auction, after I bought Ember, you said we'll see. Do you remember?" "I remember." "Did you think I was right at the time?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I thought you were looking at the right thing," he said. "Whether you were right, that I did not know. Nobody knows that in the beginning. You only know at the end. And now?" He looked at her. "Now I know," he said. Oscar died in January of the following year. Not suddenly. He had been slowing through the fall in ways that he acknowledged to Mara and dismissed to everyone else. The specific stubbornness of a man who has accepted the fact of something without being willing to make a performance of it. His hip had gotten worse. He had stopped making the walk to the fence by October. By December he was mostly on the porch, which was where she visited him. And their Tuesday mornings had become slower and quieter, less about the cattle and the plans, and more about the kind of conversation that happens when both people in it understand that the time for it is finite. He told her things in those months that she had not known, about his life before the valley, which he had never discussed in the years she'd known him, about a wife who had died young, somewhere in the crossing, on the ship between the old world and the new one, about a son he had corresponded with for 20 years who had stopped writing and from whom he had never found out why. He told her these things the way he told her most things, without asking for anything in return, without framing them as confession or as burden, simply as facts about a life that deserved to be known by someone before the person who'd lived it was no longer available to tell them. She listened the way she had learned to listen from him, completely, without interruption, letting things land at the weight they actually had rather than the weight that was comfortable. "You're going to be all right," he told her, on a Tuesday in December when the snow was on the ground and the porch was cold, but neither of them had suggested going inside. "I know," she said. "I don't mean the operation," he said. "I mean you as a person." She looked at him. "You were not all right when Thomas died," he said. "You were doing what needed doing, which is not the same thing, but you are all right now." He paused. I wanted to say it while I could. She didn't say anything for a moment. "I learned most of what I know from you," she said. "You learned it from the animals and the land," he said. "I just pointed." "That's what teaching is," she said. He thought about this. "Maybe," he said. "Yes, maybe that is what it is." He died on a Thursday night in January, in his bed, quietly, which was exactly how he would have wanted to die if he'd been the kind of man to have preferences about such things, which he wasn't. Mara found out in the morning and drove to his place and sat on his porch for an hour before she went back home to do the feeding, because the animals needed feeding regardless, and because she thought Oscar would have found it appropriate that the feeding came first. She put his chair on her porch. Not sentimentally. She told herself it was practical, that she had a spot for it and it was a good chair, but she knew, and would have admitted, if pressed, that she put it there because she wanted it to be where she could see it, because some things deserve to remain visible. In the spring, something happened that she had not planned for. Earl Goss came back. He drove in on a Tuesday morning, a Tuesday, which meant something to her now in ways it didn't used to, and he was in a different wagon than the one he'd come in 2 years before. This one was newer, not new, but newer. And the horse pulling it was not the too-thin animal she remembered, but a sound, well-fed mare that moved with the ease of an animal that has been given what it needs. He climbed down and stood at the fence and held his hat in his hands. "I've got 60 head," he said. She looked at him. "Built back," he said, "mostly from Granite's calves, the ones from that first breeding." He paused. "Best animals I've had in 20 years." "I'm glad," she said. "I want to pay you properly," he said. "For that first breeding. I've been thinking about it for 2 years. A bale of hay wasn't—" "Earl," she said. He stopped. "A bale of hay was the term," she said. "You met the term. That's done." "Mrs. Ellison, if you want to do something," she said, "then next time someone in this valley is where you were 2 years ago, you be the one who shows up." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's all you want?" "That's what keeps the thing going," she said. "Me being generous with you doesn't mean anything if it stops with you." He turned his hat in his hands. 60 head, he said again, like the number still surprised him. 60 head, she said. "That's something, Earl." "It's something," he agreed. And for the first time in all the time she'd seen him, there was something in his face that was not the weight of a man carrying loss, but something lighter than that, something that had come back from somewhere she was glad to see it come back from. He drove out, and she watched him go, and she thought about the chain of it, Chester to Ember, to Granite to Ridge, $25 to a bale of hay to 60 head, one overlooked animal to 14, names in a ledger to an entire valley's pastures, looking different than they had 5 years ago. And she thought about how the chain had links she hadn't made, hadn't planned, hadn't even known she was starting when she raised her hand in the back of a livestock pen, because something in a drooping ear told her to look twice. Danny became her foreman officially that fall. He was 21, and he had been doing the work of a foreman for 2 years, which made the formality of it somewhat beside the point, except that the formality mattered to her because she wanted him to have the title and the wage and the legal standing, because she had learned from Thomas that arrangements that exist only in the understanding of the people in them are fragile in ways that become apparent at the worst possible moments. She wrote it up. She had him sign it. She signed it herself. He looked at the paper. "You didn't have to. I know I didn't have to," she said. "I wanted it to be real. Real things have paper." He folded the paper carefully in a way that told her he understood what it meant. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the next generation, after Ridge. Tell me. If we breed Ridge to 2 of the Valley operation's best cows, not ours, theirs, we start building the bloodline outward instead of keeping it in one place." He paused. "The Ember line becomes the Valley's line, not just ours." Mara looked at him. This was the thing Oscar had meant. You pushed in the right direction and now it moves a little on its own. This was what that looked like. A 21-year-old foreman sitting across a kitchen table talking about the next generation before the current one had finished, thinking outward instead of inward, building something larger than himself without being asked to. "Write it up," she said. "A proper proposal. I want the numbers and the timeline and which operations you're thinking. You're going to look at every number." "Every number," she said, "and I'm going to tell you where I disagree." "And then?" "And then we'll decide together," she said. "That's how this works now." He nodded, and she could see him taking that in. The together, the now, the specific weight of being included in the making of something rather than just the executing of it. "Oscar would have liked this," he said. "Oscar suggested it 3 years ago," she said. "He just waited for you to think of it yourself." Danny laughed, and it was a full laugh, the laugh of someone who has just been shown the shape of something they'd been inside without knowing it. In the 5th year after the first championship, the agricultural college published a paper. Mara read it at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening. It was long and careful and written in the specific language of people who study things rather than do them, which meant it required translation in places. But the core of it was plain enough. A documented case study of a drought-resistant cattle bloodline developed on non-ideal pasture in a single operation setting, with measurable outcomes across 14 valley properties over 4 years. The Ember line. Her name was in it. Granite's name was in it. Ridge's name was in it. Danny's name was in the acknowledgments, which he would not find out about until she showed him, and which she was looking forward to showing him. Walt Cutter's name was not in it, which was an oversight she wrote to the college about in a letter that was polite and specific, and which resulted in a correction in the following issue. Chester's name was in the correction. She thought that was right. She sat at the table for a while after she finished reading. The window was dark and the porch was dark, and outside Oscar's chair sat where it had sat since January, and the south pasture was somewhere past the dark, where she couldn't see it but knew it by position, could have pointed to it with her eyes closed, the way you know the location of things that have mattered to you for long enough that they've become part of your internal map. She thought about the auction, the pen, the 30 seconds the auctioneer had given it. She thought about Blackidge's voice, that animal's already dead, and the way the laughter had moved through the crowd like something physical. She thought about $25 and a coffee tin, and $42.30, and a dead man's papers on a kitchen table, and the arithmetic that was supposed to say no. She thought about Ember, who had stood in a wagon in the November cold with the resigned posture of an animal that has been moved around too much, ear drooping, coat rough. The living embodiment of everything that a valley full of men who price things by their appearance had decided wasn't worth the ink to write up. She thought about what it meant to look at something that everyone else had looked away from and decide that looking away was not the same thing as knowing. The paper from the agricultural college sat on the table in front of her. She was 30 years old. The Kessler note was paid. The north barn was solid, if slightly off square at the southeast corner. Danny Puit's name was in the acknowledgments of a published study, and he didn't know it yet. 14 ranchers in the Callaway Valley were running cattle descended from a bull that the county's most powerful man had tried 3 times to prevent from ever standing in a show ring. Earl Goss had 60 head. Walt Cutter's Chester had his name in print, and Ember was in all of it, the way beginnings are in everything that comes after them. Not visible, exactly, but present, structural, the thing without which the rest of it doesn't exist. Mara folded the paper and put it in the tin that used to hold $42.30. She went to bed. In the morning, there was feeding to do, and a meeting with Danny about his proposal, and a letter to write to 3 of the valley's operations about the spring breeding schedule. And the east pasture needed looking at because she'd noticed the drainage running wrong after last week's rain. The work didn't stop because the story had a good chapter in it. That was the thing nobody told you when you were at the beginning of something hard, that the good chapters don't feel like endings, they feel like different kinds of work. That the version of you who raised her hand in the back of a livestock pen because something in a drooping ear said, "Look twice," was not trying to become someone the agricultural college would write about. She was trying to get through winter. And the version of you on the other side of it, if you were lucky, if you were stubborn, if you had an old man who pointed, and a boy who showed up, and a piece of land that turned out to hold something nobody had valued correctly. That version looks back at the beginning not with pride exactly, but with a specific kind of recognition. The recognition of someone who looked at the right thing at the right moment and didn't look away. That was all it had ever been. That was all it needed to be.